The sun was already high when the first heat began to shimmer off the dusty main street of Willow Creek. It was Saturday, market day, and the town had that restless hum it always did when the locals mixed with ranchers and traders from the hills. Wagons rolled in, loaded with sacks of flour, crates of apples, and bundles of leather hides. Horses snorted and stamped against hitching rails. The air carried the sharp scent of sun-warmed hay, mingled with the tang of dust kicked up by boots and wheels. Men leaned against posts outside the saloon, hats tilted low, scanning the street for entertainment. Women in long skirts bustled between the general store and the baker's, baskets swinging at their sides. A pack of children darted through the crowd, shrieking with laughter until a stern-faced shopkeeper barked at them to mind themselves. It was an ordinary market morning, until the sound of heavy hooves and the creak of wagon wheels drew every eye toward the south end of the street. The wagon came slow, flanked on either side by two men on horseback, both wearing dust-stained coats and wide-brimmed hats pulled low against the sun. They were armed, the dull glint of their rifles catching the light as they rode. Between them, chained to the wagon bed, was a squat iron cage. Inside, a woman stood as if the bars weren't there at all. The murmurs started immediately. "That her?" someone whispered. "Clara Dawson," came the answer. "Mountain woman. Killed two men in Bitter Rock with her bare hands." "Three," another corrected, as if keeping score. "Shot a sheriff once," a man near the livery muttered. "Or so they say." The rumors swirled and tangled until no one could tell fact from exaggeration. The only truth was standing plain in that cage. She was tall, taller than most men in the crowd, with shoulders squared and chin lifted in a way that made even the loudest of gossips pause. Her clothes looked like they had been pulled straight off the mountains. A faded cotton shirt patched at the elbows, trousers worn thin at the knees, and boots scuffed nearly white from rock and dust. The sun had baked her skin into a deep, wind-burned bronze. Her hair was a wild tumble of dark chestnut, streaked with lighter strands from long hours under the open sky. It fell loose around her face, unbrushed, the ends curling with stubborn defiance. Her eyes, gray, sharp as the edge of a knife, moved over the crowd without settling too long on anyone. When they did meet a gaze, it was only for a heartbeat before sliding on, as though weighing whether the person was worth her attention, and finding the answer was no. The wagon came to a stop in the middle of the street. The bounty hunters dismounted, boots thudding against the dirt, and one leaned against the bars as if to remind her of their presence. She didn't so much as glance at him. From the open doors of Barrett's Feed and Supply, Eli Barrett caught the sound of the crowd shifting. He'd been sorting sacks of oats in the back, keeping an ear out for the usual market chatter, but this was something else. The tone in those voices was sharper, more electric. Curiosity pulled him out onto the boardwalk. He saw the cage first, then the woman inside it, and for a moment he simply stood there, one hand resting against the doorframe. Something about the way she held herself, straight-backed, unyielding, caught him off guard. It wasn't the posture of someone broken. It was the stance of someone who had spent her life standing her ground. The townsfolk had formed a loose ring around the wagon. Some hung back, peeking from behind the safety of storefronts. Others stepped close enough to point and whisper. A few men laughed loud enough for her to hear, their voices heavy, with the kind of mockery reserved for those they feared but didn't understand. Clara Dawson didn't flinch. The heat pressed down like a hand, sweat sliding down the side of her face, but she didn't wipe it away. Her hands were at her sides, fingers curled loosely, ready for something if it came. She didn't shift her weight or break her stance. Even in a cage, she refused to cower. A boy, no more than 10, crept forward until his mother yanked him back. Clara's eyes flicked to him, and for a fraction of a second, her expression softened. Then the steel returned, and she looked away. Eli watched her in silence. He couldn't decide if what stirred in him was respect or something older, something he hadn't felt in years. She was a stranger, accused of things he didn't know were true, but there was no mistaking the kind of strength she carried. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The bounty hunters barked at the crowd to keep back. One of them spat in the dust, muttering to his partner. Clara didn't acknowledge them. She stared past the street, past the buildings, toward the far-off hills, as if she could still see some place that mattered to her. A gust of wind kicked grit into the air, stinging eyes and rattling the signs on the shop fronts. The townsfolk blinked and shielded their faces, but Clara stood as though she barely noticed. From where Eli stood, he could see the small details: the fraying thread at the cuff of her shirt, the faint scar along her left jaw, the dirt under her fingernails. Every piece of her told a story, though none of it was spoken. He realized then that he was staring. Forcing himself to look away, he busied his hands by straightening a sack of grain that didn't need straightening. But his mind didn't leave her, not even as the voices in the street grew louder and the heat pressed harder. She was a caged woman in the middle of Willow Creek, and yet somehow she didn't look trapped at all. The sun slid higher, burning the shadows off the street until the whole of Willow Creek was laid bare in the glare. The iron bars of the cage shimmered with heat. Clara Dawson shifted just enough to keep her palms from the scorching metal. The bounty hunters leaned on the wagon as though they had all the time in the world. One of them, the taller of the two, scanned the crowd with a lazy smirk. "Ain't much to see, folks. Just another outlaw caught and paid for." His voice was the kind meant to invite trouble. No one answered. The murmurs had died to a watchful hush. Clara kept her eyes forward, letting the noise of the street wash over her without a flicker. She was used to stares. She'd been collecting them for years. From the edge of the boardwalk, Eli Barrett stepped down into the street. His boots sank a little into the loose dust. He didn't know why he moved closer, only that something in her stance, silent, unbroken, pulled at him in a way he hadn't expected. A man beside him spat and muttered, "Ought to keep a beast like that in chains." Eli didn't answer, but his jaw tightened. He had seen enough cruelty disguised as justice to know the weight of careless words. The shorter bounty hunter caught Eli's approach. "You got business here?" His tone carried that edge of a man ready to assert his authority. Eli kept his voice even. "Just looking." "Look from there," the man said, jerking his chin toward the boardwalk. Clara's gaze flicked toward Eli, holding for a breath, then moved past him. It was a look without plea, without shame, just the acknowledgement of another presence. The tall bounty hunter tapped the bars with a gloved finger. "You know why they're here gawking, don't you, Clara? They want to see the wild thing in a cage. That's all you are to 'em." She finally spoke, her voice low but steady. "Takes a small man to talk big from the other side of iron." A ripple ran through the crowd. The tall man's smirk faltered. He stepped back, muttering something to his partner. Eli caught himself almost smiling. It had been a long time since he'd heard anyone throw words like that with such calm precision. The heat kept building. Sweat rolled down Eli's back under his shirt. The crowd thinned as market business called them away, but a stubborn handful stayed, hungry for more spectacle. A woman selling apples across the street called out, "Heard she left a trail of bodies in the mountains." "That true?" Clara didn't answer. "She won't tell you," one of the bounty hunters said. "She's headed for the judge in Carson. He'll get it out of her." The wagon creaked as they shifted its weight. Eli noticed the horse hitched to it, thin ribs just showing. It flicked its ears back at the constant drone of voices. He stepped closer, resting a hand on its neck. The animal trembled faintly, but didn't shy. "You feeding this one enough?" he asked without looking up. "Not your concern," the shorter bounty hunter said. Eli let it drop, but the question lingered in his mind. Men who didn't care for their horses rarely cared for much else either. He turned his head and found Clara watching him again. This time, her gaze held for longer. There was no gratitude in it, but there was recognition, like she was measuring him the way she might measure a fence line or a storm cloud. The moment broke when the tall bounty hunter swung back into the saddle. "We're watering the horses at the trough, then we're moving on," he said. "Keep your distance." They rolled the wagon forward. Clara's shoulders shifted with the motion, but her chin stayed high. Eli watched them go, dust rising in their wake. He didn't know why he felt the pull to follow. Maybe it was the way she never once dropped her head, even under all those eyes. Maybe it was the quiet challenge in her stare. By the time they reached the trough, most of the crowd had gone. Eli drifted that way, keeping to the side of the street. He pretended interest in a stack of harness straps outside the leather shop, but his eyes were on the wagon. The hunters watered their mounts first, then grudgingly hauled a bucket for the wagon horse. Clara stood still in the cage, her hands now gripping the bars, not in desperation, but as though testing their strength. "You break those, you'll be shot before you hit the ground," the short one told her. "I know," she said simply. Her voice was stronger this time, carrying just enough for Eli to hear. It had a texture to it, like creek water running over stone, shaped by years of wind and grit. The tall one climbed back up, flicked the reins, and the wagon rolled on. They were heading for the North Road, toward the sheriff's small station at the edge of town. Eli stayed where he was, but his eyes followed them until they disappeared in the glare. The market noise swelled again around him, but it sounded different now, as though some thread had been pulled loose in the fabric of the day. He went back to his store, the familiar scent of grain and burlap greeting him, but the image of her, tall, fierce, unbowed in that cage, lodged in his mind. He told himself it was just curiosity. He didn't believe it. The road north out of Willow Creek was a ribbon of baked earth, rutted from wagon wheels and littered with pale stones that flashed under the sun. The bounty hunters kept the wagon steady, their horses plodding ahead while the iron cage rocked with every dip and rise in the path. Clara Dawson shifted her stance to keep her footing, the floor of the cage creaking beneath her boots. The air tasted of dust and heat, and the sound of the wagon's wooden joints groaning was the only rhythm marking the miles. The taller hunter glanced over his shoulder now and then, watching her the way a man watches an animal he doesn't quite trust. The shorter one rode with his rifle across his saddle horn, chewing on a strip of dried meat. Neither spoke much. They didn't need to. The job was simple: deliver the prisoner, collect the pay. At the far end of town, near the line where weathered buildings gave way to open land, the sheriff's station squatted low against the horizon. It was little more than 2 rooms and a holding pen, but it served as the last stop before prisoners were moved to the larger court in Carson. The hunters pulled up out front, dust curling around the wagon wheels before settling on the porch boards. Sheriff Warren came out, a lean man with a bristled jaw and a limp that made his steps uneven. He eyed the wagon first, then the woman inside. His expression didn't change much, but his gaze lingered longer than most men's did. "You hauled her all the way from Bitter Rock?" he asked. The tall hunter nodded. 3 days straight. She's a quiet one, but I wouldn't turn my back on her. Warren's eyes narrowed slightly. "That's so?" Clara said nothing. She met the sheriff's stare for a heartbeat before looking away toward the far hills. The hunters dismounted, unhooking the cage from the wagon. The scrape of metal against wood made a harsh note in the still air. Warren unlocked the pen beside the station, and the men rolled the cage inside. When the door clanged shut, one of them muttered something about getting paid and heading out before sundown. Eli Barrett should have been back at his store, sorting the last of the seed shipments, but instead he found himself standing at the edge of the station porch, his hat pulled low. He told himself he just wanted to see if the rumors matched the truth. But the truth was, he'd followed them here without even meaning to, drawn by something he couldn't name. Warren noticed him. "Need something, Barrett?" Eli shook his head. "Just passing through." The sheriff grunted and turned back to the hunters. Coins clinked into calloused hands. The men didn't linger. Within minutes they were mounted again, riding back toward the South Road with the kind of speed that said they were glad to be free of their cargo. When the dust settled, only Clara remained in the pen. The iron bars cast long shadows across her face. She leaned against one side, the angle of her body casual, but her eyes stayed sharp, sweeping the yard, the road, the sky. "You want water?" Warren asked her. She glanced at him, then at the tin cup he held. For a moment it looked like she might refuse just to prove a point. but the heat won. She stepped forward, took the cup, and drank. The movement was efficient, almost mechanical. But when she handed it back, her fingers brushed his just long enough to make him blink. Eli watched from where he stood. He saw the same thing he'd seen earlier, that refusal to shrink. Even in a cage, with iron at her back and strangers measuring her worth in bounty money, she carried herself like someone who had never once asked permission to exist. The afternoon wore on, the light shifting from the flat glare of noon to the deeper gold of late day. A freight wagon rattled past on its way to the depot. A pair of riders stopped to speak with Warren, glancing at Clara now and then but not getting close. When Warren stepped inside the station to fetch paperwork, Eli moved closer to the pen. He stopped a few feet from the bars, his boots in the shadow they cast. Clara turned her head toward him, and for the first time he saw something different in her expression. Not softness, not exactly, but a flicker of curiosity. "You followed us," she said. He hesitated. "Road goes this way." "That your story?" Her voice was even, not mocking, but the words slid under his skin all the same. Eli took his time before answering. "I've seen plenty of men in cages, not many women, not like you." She studied him for a moment, as if trying to decide what he meant by that. "Like me," she repeated. Not a question, just a test. He didn't offer more, and she didn't press. The silence stretched until the sound of boots on the porch announced Warren's return. Eli stepped back without looking away from her. The sheriff locked the station for the night, leaving the pen under the wide eye of the moon. He didn't seem worried. Either he trusted the bars, or he trusted that Clara wouldn't run into the open land without a plan. Eli walked back toward his store under a sky turning violet at the edges. Every step felt heavier than it should have, his mind pulling back to the image of her standing in that pen, watching him without flinching. He told himself it was none of his concern, but as he pushed open the feed store door and the scent of grain closed around him, he knew he'd be back by morning. In the pen, Clara leaned against the bars, eyes fixed on the darkening horizon. Somewhere out there was the line she'd crossed, the one they claimed made her dangerous. Somewhere out there was the place she'd call home if the world ever let her. For now, there was only iron, dust, and the quiet knowledge that she had not yet decided how this story would end. The morning in Willow Creek began slow, the kind of slow that made every sound stand out. The rattle of the blacksmith's hammer rang sharp through the still air. The low rumble of a wagon crossing the bridge over Willow Creek's narrow river drifted in from the south. A dog barked somewhere near the livery, short and impatient, and then all was quiet again except for the scrape of boots on dirt as Eli Barrett made his way toward the sheriff's station. The sun was only just up, casting long shadows across the street. A cool breeze still clung to the edges of the day, but Eli knew it wouldn't last. By noon, the air would be heavy with heat, the dust thick enough to taste. He kept his hands in his pockets, his steps steady, but his mind was anything but calm. He told himself he was just checking in with Warren. The sheriff sometimes needed supplies from the feed store, sacks of grain, lantern oil, a new length of rope. But deep down he knew that wasn't the reason his boots were carrying him there before breakfast. The reason had iron bars around it and gray eyes that seemed to see straight through a man. When he reached the station, Warren was already on the porch, sitting in a worn chair with his coffee cup balanced on one knee. The steam curled in the morning light. "You're up early," Warren said, not looking surprised. "Had business," Eli replied. "Uh-huh." The sheriff sipped his coffee, then jerked his chin toward the side of the building. "She's still there." Eli stepped off the porch without asking permission. The pen sat in the side yard. Its shadow stretched long across the dry ground. Clara Dawson stood inside, her back to him, facing the far fence line where the land rolled out toward the hills. She didn't move when he approached, but he could tell she knew he was there. People like her always knew. "You sleep?" he asked. She didn't turn. "Not much." "Hard ground'll do that." Her shoulders lifted in the faintest shrug. "I've slept on worse." He moved closer, stopping just outside the bars. She turned her head then, slow and deliberate, and those gray eyes locked on him. There was no greeting in them, no warmth, but no dismissal either. "You always visit prisoners?" she asked. "Only the interesting ones." That earned him the smallest flicker of a smile, there and gone so quick he almost thought he imagined it. "You'll get people talking," she said. "They already do," he answered. A long pause stretched between them. Somewhere in the street, a shop door opened and a man's voice called out to his horse. The sound faded, leaving just the two of them in that quiet space between bars. "You headed to Carson today?" Eli asked. "That's what they say." "You got someone there waiting to speak for you?" She leaned against the bars, the metal pressing into her arm. "I've got no one." The way she said it, without self-pity, without anger, hit him harder than he expected. He wanted to ask more, but Warren's voice cut across the yard. "Barrett, you planning on buying something or just loitering?" Eli stepped back. "I'll be by later," he called. Clara watched him go. She didn't call out, didn't move to the bars, but as he reached the edge of the porch, he glanced back and caught her still looking at him. By midday, the heat had settled in heavy, the air shimmered above the road, and the smell of hot dust clung to every breath. Eli was back at his store, stacking feed sacks, when the rumble of wheels made him pause. He stepped to the doorway just as a fresh wagon rolled into view, driven by a man he didn't recognize. Behind it came Warren on horseback, and behind Warren, the iron cage. Clara was inside, seated now, her arms resting on her knees, head tilted forward slightly as if conserving her strength. Her hair caught the sunlight in tangled strands. The cage jolted with every bump, but she didn't flinch. They were moving her. Eli didn't think. He just grabbed his hat, stepped into the street, and fell into step with the wagon as it passed. Warren saw him and gave a questioning look. "Road's long to Carson," Eli said. Warren grunted. "And?" "Figure you could use another man along in case there's trouble." Warren studied him for a moment, then nodded once. "Suit yourself." The road out of Willow Creek stretched north, the landscape flattening into open range before climbing toward the low mountains. They traveled in silence at first, the creak of wheels and the steady clop of hooves the only sounds. Eli walked beside the cage when he could, the sun beating down on his hat brim. Clara didn't speak, but every so often her eyes met his, and that was enough to keep him there. By late afternoon, the heat broke just enough for a breeze to stir. They stopped near a dry creek bed to water the horses and rest. Warren kept a careful eye on Clara as she stepped out of the cage to stretch, her wrists still bound. She moved like someone used to the weight of iron, as if it were just another thing to carry. Eli handed her a tin cup of water. She took it without thanks, but their fingers brushed again, and this time she didn't pull away quickly. She drank, wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and looked at him. "You think I did it," she said. "I think I don't know you." Her gaze held his for a long moment. "That's fair." Warren called them back, and soon they were moving again, the shadows lengthening across the land. The night would bring cooler air, maybe even the faint scent of sage on the wind. But Eli knew the real change in the air had nothing to do with weather. It was in the way her eyes lingered longer now, in the way his steps matched the rhythm of the cage wheels without him realizing it, in the quiet pull of something neither of them had named yet. They rode on toward Carson, but the road felt less certain than it had that morning. The first pale light of dawn found the camp still and quiet. The fire had burned down to a bed of red coals, sending up the occasional hiss when a gust of wind stirred the ashes. The horses shifted in their sleep, tails flicking lazily at flies that had not yet woken. Eli sat on an overturned crate a few paces from the cage, his elbows resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the horizon where the sun would soon break. He had been awake most of the night, not because of danger, though danger was never far on these roads, but because his mind refused to let him rest. Inside the cage, Clara Dawson sat with her back to the bars, knees drawn up, head resting against her arms. She wasn't sleeping either. Every so often she would lift her head, just enough to scan the darkness beyond the camp, then settle again without a word. Her stillness was not the stillness of exhaustion. It was the stillness of a creature who could move in an instant if she needed to. Warren emerged from his bedroll with the stiffness of a man used to hard ground. He poured what remained of the coffee into a tin mug and took a long swallow, his eyes moving from Eli to Clara and back again. "We'll be in Carson by midday if the road stays clear," he said, his voice low from sleep. Clara didn't respond, but Eli caught the faintest twitch in her jaw. She had not asked where they were going. She already knew. They broke camp quickly. Warren hitched the horses while Eli gathered the few supplies they had scattered the night before. When the wagon was ready, Warren unlocked the cage long enough for Clara to step out and stretch her legs. Her wrists were still bound, but she moved as though the irons were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Eli noticed the way she scanned the tree line, the slope of the land, even the clouds above, measuring every detail, committing it to memory. "Water," Warren said, holding out a cup. She took it, drank, and handed it back without a word. They set off, the wagon creaking under its own weight, the road narrowing as it cut through low hills. The sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the morning chill. Eli walked beside the wagon for a time, then fell back to ride alongside Warren. "You don't talk much to her," Eli said. "Not my job to talk," Warren replied. "My job's to deliver her breathing." "You believe what they say she did?" Warren's eyes stayed on the road. "I believe enough to keep my gun close." Eli didn't press. The truth was, he wasn't sure what he believed either. By mid-morning, the road dipped into a shallow valley where a thin stream crossed their path. They stopped to let the horses drink. Warren stayed with them while Eli went to the cage. Clara was sitting cross-legged on the floor, her back straight, eyes half closed. "You look like you're somewhere else," Eli said. "Maybe I am," she answered without opening her eyes. "Where's that?" She let a beat of silence pass before answering. "Anywhere but here." He almost smiled. "You planning to get there?" Her eyes opened then, sharp and unreadable. "Everyone's planning to get somewhere." They didn't speak again until Warren called him back. The road ahead was climbing now, winding between rocky outcrops that threw patches of shade across the dirt. The air smelled of sun-warmed stone and sage. It was just past noon when Warren held up a hand. Eli stopped beside him. Ahead, the road narrowed to a single track between two jagged walls of rock. "Bad place for an ambush," Warren muttered. Eli scanned the ridgelines. The stone was too steep for horses, but a man on foot could move across it quick enough. He caught the faint glint of something. Metal, maybe, before it vanished. "Riders?" Eli asked. "Not yet, but they're up there." Warren's voice was calm, but his hand slid to the rifle at his side. He turned to the wagon. "Keep her in there and stay sharp." The first shot came from the left ridge. It hit the dirt a few yards ahead of the wagon, sending up a puff of dust. The horses snorted and shifted, but Warren steadied them. Another shot rang out from the right. This one sparked off the metal of the cage. Clara didn't flinch. Then the riders came. 4 of them, masks covering their faces, rifles in hand. They didn't rush. They came at a steady pace, knowing they had the advantage. Warren raised his rifle. "Turn around and ride out," he called. The lead rider laughed, a sound that echoed off the stone. "We ain't here for you, Sheriff. We're here for her." Eli's eyes went to Clara. She was standing now, hands gripping the bars, her gaze locked on the riders. There was no fear there, only recognition. "You know them?" Eli asked. She didn't answer. The riders fanned out, 2 on each side. Warren fired first, the crack of his rifle echoing down the pass. One of the riders fell, his horse bolting. The others surged forward. Eli drew his revolver, firing at the closest one. The shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him from the saddle. The last 2 pressed on. One veered toward the wagon, reaching for the cage lock. Clara stepped back just as Eli's next shot took the rider's hat clean off, sending him reeling. The 4th rider swung his rifle toward Eli, but but Warren's bullet dropped him before he could fire. Silence fell as the echoes died. The air smelled of gunpowder and sweat. The horses were trembling, eyes rolling white. Warren lowered his rifle, scanning the ridge for movement. "Clear," he said finally. Eli holstered his gun and went to the wagon. Clara was still standing, her breathing even, though a thin line of blood ran down her temple where a fragment of stone had grazed her. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded once. "You're not bad with that gun." "Neither are you, I'd wager," he said, eyeing the way she carried herself. Warren came over, his face tight. "We need to move. There'll be more." They got the wagon moving again, faster this time, the horses straining against the harness. Eli stayed close to the cage, his eyes on the road ahead, but his thoughts on the way she had looked at those riders. Not with surprise, but with the quiet certainty of someone who knew exactly why they had come. By the time Carson's outskirts came into view, the sun was low, and the land was bathed in that strange gold light that makes everything sharper. Warren drove straight to the jailhouse, a squat stone building with barred windows. He and Eli moved quickly, unloading supplies and securing the wagon. Clara stepped out of the cage without resistance, the chains at her wrists clinking softly. Inside, the jail smelled of oil and old wood. Warren led her to a cell and locked the door. She sat on the narrow cot, her back against the wall, eyes following Eli as he lingered by the bars. "You gonna stick around?" she asked. "Maybe," he said. Her mouth curved just enough to be called a smile. "Then I guess we'll see what kind of man you are." Eli didn't answer. He just stood there for a moment longer, then turned and walked out into the cooling evening, knowing that whatever happened next, this was far from over. Sometimes the wild roads of the West bring strangers together in ways no one can explain, and in those brief moments, a man may find himself standing at the edge of a story that's only just begun. What started as a prisoner's journey to Carson now carries the weight of secrets, danger, and an unspoken connection neither of them can deny. And out here, under the wide western sky, the end of one trail might just be the beginning of another. If you've enjoyed riding along with this tale, be sure to subscribe to Wild West Love Chronicles so you don't miss the next gripping story of passion, danger, and unexpected bonds forged in the dust of the frontier.